Well, General Ham, thank you so much for that introduction. Thank you for getting my title right. So I woke up the morning of January 20th. I had a really easy title. I was the Army's Deputy Chief Management Officer. 4 words, really easy. I knew exactly what I was doing. Everybody understood the title. And then by noon, I got what is probably the most confusing and the longest title in Washington, D.C. It has been a great privilege to serve performing the duties of the Undersecretary. It's been great working with the team, the Honorable Bob Speer as the Acting Secretary. The whole staff and Secretariat, the Army commands are really pulled together. And I know a lot of people in the headquarters say, you know, things are working as well now as they ever have been because we're all working together. We've all known one another for a long time, and we're able to get things done. So I want to say thank you to everybody who's made my life easier in the last 7 weeks. General Ham, I want to thank you for your leadership of the Association of the United States Army. I also want to thank you for your 38 years of selfless service. Thanks to all of the members of AUSA for coming to this conference, for making it such a great show. I was on the floor yesterday. I got to talk to a lot of old friends, got to meet some new friends, and see some extraordinary things that industry is doing for our Army and for our nation. I want to thank the staff of AUSA for putting this on. I know there have been a lot of last-minute changes, a lot of things you've had to adjust to. Believe me, since I got the call Friday night saying that I was going to be here yesterday morning, I know exactly what it's like to react to changing circumstances. And I appreciate everything you've done to make this work. I want to say a special thanks to Mayor Battle and the people of Huntsville. You know, America's Army is only as good as the support we get from America's communities. And Huntsville, I think we will all agree, does an extraordinary job of taking care of our soldiers, our Army civilians, and their families. And I say thank you very much. Now, there are 2 things that I'd like you to take away from my speech this morning. First of all, the priorities of the Acting Secretary. His priorities are very much in sync with the priorities of Secretary Mattis and of General Milley. The priorities are readiness, people, and resources. So I ask you to remember that as I talk this morning and as you think back on the things you've heard from yesterday's speakers. I also want you to remember this. In the conversations that Secretary Mattis, Secretary Speer, the Chief, the Vice, and I have had with people on Capitol Hill, what they're telling us is very clear. They will help us rebuild the United States Army. What they need in exchange is reform. Reform of the way we do business. We must do business more effectively and efficiently in the future. And that means all of us, the Army and industry. You heard Ms. Easter talk about that yesterday. You heard General Perna talk about that yesterday. And you're going to hear me talk about that this morning. So remember, the 2 things. Number 1, the Secretary's priorities, readiness, people, resources, and then the deal that Congress is asking us to make. Rebuild, but we need reform. Now, I think it's important in a speech like this to think about history. I'm 64 years old. Next month, I'll be 65. That means that I'm a child of the 20th century. I was born right smack in the middle of the 20th century. And growing up, I had the privilege of knowing veterans from World War I, World War II, and the Korean War. The veterans of World War I, which included both of my grandfathers, told me that the United States was woefully unprepared for that war. We were so unprepared that we had to borrow our tanks, our aircraft, our artillery, our machine guns from our allies. We couldn't produce them ourselves in time for the war. And then immediately after the war, we demilitarized. We shrank the Army down to incredibly small numbers. We cut the pay. There were actually hearings on Capitol Hill decrying the defense industry, calling them the merchants of death. America turned away from a leadership role in the world. And then came the Second World War. And I had the privilege of knowing many veterans of that war. My dad was an infantry platoon leader in northern Italy. Most of my friends' fathers were veterans. One flew a B-17 for the 8th Air Force. One received the Silver Star at Iwo Jima, lost an eye, an arm, and a leg there. Another fought with Patton in the relief of Bastogne. And what they told me, again, was the United States was not ready for the Second World War. My father, being an infantryman, told me stories that he had heard about Kasserine Pass, how the Army's unreadiness led to the defeat. And then I got to know veterans of the Korean War. And my dad was one of those who got mobilized during the Korean War, was a training officer for basic training at Fort Dix, New Jersey, with the 9th Division. And he talked about how unready the United States was for that conflict. And again, being an infantryman, he told me about Task Force Smith. And again, what unreadiness meant for our nation, but particularly for the soldiers in the field. So now we're at a crossroads where we have to look at readiness again. And the question is what are we going to do to learn from history? The Army is currently meeting its global commitments and providing significant capabilities to the Joint Force. We are a third of DoD's forces. We have 184,000 soldiers in 143 countries. We contribute more money, more support for infrastructure, more contracting, and more logistics to support the Joint Force than any other service. The high operational tempo of the last 15 years is something we've been able to support and sustain over that time. However, things are fraying, just like a rope against a rock. We have to figure out what we're going to do to regain and sustain the readiness this Army needs to defend the nation. Our aging systems are expensive to maintain, and no longer provide the overmatch we need to win. Our organizational models and systems are also outdated. It's difficult for us to access innovation in industry. You know, whenever I think about our relationship with industry, I think about the Manhattan Project. The Manhattan Project was an amazing team of military, academia, and industry, focused on one of the most difficult challenges that had ever occurred, and who together created the most advanced and world-changing weapon ever developed. Where are the General Groveses? Where are the Robert Oppenheimers? Where are the Karl T. Comptons of today? So Groves was the general who kept the bureaucracy away from Oppenheimer and his team so that they could do the extraordinary work that they did. Karl Compton was the president of MIT who brought together industry partners to enable Oppenheimer to do the work that he did. And that combination of Groves, Oppenheimer, and Compton made the difference. Where are we going to find those people today? How are we going to build that team of the military, of academia, and of industry? And I think that's something that all of us ought to think about while we're here today. Today, there are potential adversaries fielding missile, rocket, and artillery systems that outrange our own systems. They are capable of defeating even our most heavily armored vehicles. Now, we are working hard to provide active protection systems that will keep our vehicle crew members safe and our vehicles in the fight. We need modernized MLRS launchers as well as munitions that enable us to shoot further and more accurately. We will ensure that our soldiers don't show up in a gunfight outgunned. Potential adversaries are also finding new and more effective ways to attack from the air. Again, with more capable missiles, rockets, and the new twist, unmanned aerial systems. A simple Google search reveals that our adversaries are using increasingly capable varieties of unmanned aerial systems to fight in new ways. To counter these tactics and techniques, we need a suite of integrated capabilities for counter-UAS. However, none of our advanced capabilities matter if the enemy can simply knock them out using electronic warfare or cyber attack. There is an ongoing race to keep EW resistant and cyber secure command and control and ISR platforms a step ahead of an innovative adversary. Together, we are developing an array of resilient, secure, and interoperable systems that will retain our long-held advantage in tactical situational awareness. The Army must continue to modernize. It's an increasingly interconnected and crowded world out there, where traditional threats remain, but new threats are emerging in cyberspace, the electromagnetic spectrum, and in new areas like artificial intelligence, autonomous combat systems, and the biological sciences. There may actually be an unforgiving window in the next decade where a few adversaries can achieve parity in some capabilities with us before we have a chance to leap ahead once again. They will not only oppose us on future battlefields, they will attempt to use these capabilities to prevent us from getting to the battlefield in the first place. To win under these conditions, we need innovative solutions that reduce our dependence on logistics strains and protect our long-distance sustainment links. You heard General Perna talk about that very thing yesterday morning. For the foreseeable future, the majority of Army forces are going to be based here in the continental United States. In addition to reinforcing strategic lift capabilities and capacities, we must investigate new ways for our land forces to rapidly get to the point of need. Again, as General Perna outlined yesterday, perhaps the most effective way for adversaries to defeat us will be to stop us from ever leaving the United States. There is enormous scope for this. Cyber attacks on airports and railheads, transportation systems and infrastructure, logistics tracking and routing systems, port facilities, or shipboard navigation systems. Once ships leave port, they will be vulnerable to attack from a number of domains. But you know, those aren't even the worst threats that we face. In the nearly 2 months Bob Spear's been the acting Secretary of the Army, he has been out on the road talking to soldiers and civilians, talking to families. And he's been asking, what is the greatest threat to our nation? I think most people expect people to say, well, it's Russia, it's China, it's Iran, it's North Korea, it's ISIS. And they are enormous threats to us. However, the answer he gets is that the real threat to our nation is the lack of consistent, reliable, and sufficient funding to provide our Army the tools needed to ensure our defense from any adversary. The persistent uncertainty in our fiscal environment constrains our ability to ensure these resources and the tools we need are available now and in the future. We absolutely need Congress to provide predictable funding to increase the Army's for the increased Army end strength that we got in this year's Authorization Act. So we got the authority to increase the end strength of the Army. What we didn't get yet is the money to do so. So we need that money. We need that money to pay the soldiers. We need that money to train the soldiers, to equip the soldiers, to make sure that they're ready. The current fiscal environment makes the business of organizing, training, and equipping the Army very difficult. Remember, the Budget Control Act is still the law of the land. The Bipartisan Budget Act suspended sequestration for 2 years. That suspension is up on 30th of September of this year. Congress needs to deal with that. If sequestration takes place on 1 October, it will have an immediate detrimental impact on the Army. So we need legislation to provide relief from sequester to avert reductions in manpower, in readiness, and in modernization in fiscal years 18 to 21. Now remember, Congress still hasn't passed an Appropriations Act for FY17. We're still operating under a continuing resolution that expires on the 28th of April, not all that far away. The House has passed the Appropriations Act. It's actually pretty favorable for the Army. It gives us some of the money we need. But the Senate has yet to act. And again, they must act before the 28th of April to ensure that we have the readiness that we need, particularly as the Army is going to that new end strength called for in the 17 Authorization Act. Finally, of course, the increased end strength requires additional readiness and sustainment funding. These requirements, combined with our movement to correct the damage done to our modernization efforts by years of continuing resolutions, makes passing the FY18 budget, first the 17 budget, a budget amendment that's currently over at OMB to amend the 17 Act, and then getting us the funding we need for FY18 on time so we can do what we need to do. And you know the problems with a continuing resolution. Here's what's happening to us right now. We've had to delay over 120 programs that would enhance modernization, give us additional weapons and platforms, and allow us to move forward on 50 critical New START programs. 50 programs we can't start on right now because of the CR. We also, because it's getting late in the fiscal year, when we actually do get the appropriations, it'll be a challenge for us to ensure that we can obligate it in this fiscal year. So for years we've been shifting money to cover competing priorities. We've been mortgaging our modernization future to take care of near-term readiness. We need congressional help to keep us from having to do that. We need the 17 budget, the 17 budget amendment, and the 18 budget. In the end, maintaining a ready and capable Army deters potential adversaries, and should a crisis occur, allows us to win decisively with fewer casualties. So let's talk about the need for partnership between the Army and industry. Maintaining our advantage as the world's most dominant land force requires that we reimagine how we work with the defense industry. Our focus must be on providing solutions and solving problems, not simply on checking a list of requirements. I know that many voices in business have already advocated this, and DoD must act. We must redouble our efforts to make this happen. Let's talk about the outcomes we're trying to achieve rather than having a checklist of requirements. You know, for a long time, DoD led the way in fielding new capabilities and technologies. However, I think because of the pace of technological change, industry is now ahead of where the Army is. And we need to take advantage of the extraordinary work industry has been doing. We won't always have the agility or capacity to figure out how to take advantage of new technology. That's why we need to partner with the private sector. And this will mean a greater number of solutions must be driven by business incentives and competitive opportunities. Accomplishing this will require the Defense Department to make change to its organizational culture. We must be more open and willing to work with our industry partners. Often, I think, our inflexibility frustrates those who have worked with us for a long time, and it deters new, innovative companies from partnering with us in the first place. They just don't want to put up with the bureaucracy. Remember, bureaucracy is about compliance. Compliance is about enforcement. Compliance comes when we fail to act like professionals. Compliance comes when people say, you can't be trusted. We need to have the trust of Congress. We need to have the trust of the taxpayer. We need to make sure that it's not about a checklist. Have we done everything we're supposed to do? It's about what are the outcomes, what are the capabilities that our soldiers need to fight and win on the battlefield? What are the capabilities that will deter our adversaries in the future so we don't have to fight? But it has to be, how can we get people to trust us? How do we be the professionals we aspire to be so that we don't have this long list of things with which we must comply? That's why we need to reform the way we do business. That's why we need to be more effective and efficient. We can't afford not to be. And to continue with statutes and regulations that are about compliance is simply not going to help. That, I think, is the shared responsibility we in the Army have with you in industry. We have to work together to figure out how we can do business better in the future, so we can convince Congress that, yes, if you help us rebuild, we will use this money responsibly. One of the things that is going on right now in the Department is the great work we're doing moving towards auditability. Remember why industry, why corporations have auditable books. They do that because they want their investors to trust them, that the investors know where the money is. They know how the money is being used. That's why corporations work so hard to have their independent public accountants certify their books. It's about trust. We need to be able to do things with the same things with our books. We have to have our books in a way that they are certified so that we can prove to Congress and the American people that we're using the money that they give us responsibly for the purposes for which it was given to us. That's why auditability is so important. And indeed, Secretary Mattis has made this one of the things that he's clearly focused on during his tenure. This will allow, in addition to getting the trust of Congress and the American people, it will allow Army leaders to make better decisions about what to do. Because we'll be able to see the true cost of things, we'll be able to see where our investments are paying off and where they're not, where the money should go and where we should take the money away. That's something we need for all of our programs. That allows us to go to Congress and say, if you give us the money, you can trust us to use it to do the right thing. You know, private enterprise is already using big data analytics to do business. We need to be doing the same thing in the United States Army. I know General Perna talked about this yesterday in terms of logistics. But there's a lot more we can be doing. Tools exist for us to put in the right kind of controls and the right kind of metrics so we can show that we're achieving the outcomes, not that we're meeting some arbitrary rule, but we're achieving the outcomes that we need. And remember, the product of the Department of the Army are the trained and ready units that the combatant commanders use to fight and win. We can be 100% in everything else we do. If we're not producing those trained and ready units, we fail. And that's why we must be more effective and more efficient in the way that we do business. I want to give a special thanks to the work that AMC has been doing on auditability. General Perna, Alicia Adams, and Sue Goodyear, the rest of the team, have really done extraordinary work in this area. They've set up cross-functional audit cells. They have successful audit programs that commanders are involved in at the beginning. AMC has really led the way in auditability. And, sir, I want to say thanks to you and your team for everything you've done. So, I know I've covered a lot, but let's go back to the two things I want you to remember. Number one, the Secretary's priorities. We talked about readiness and how important it is. We talked about the history of the United States in the 20th century not being ready. and how we paid for that with the blood of our soldiers. Readiness is paramount to the Secretary of Defense, to the Secretary Speer, and to General Milley, and Congress understands that. It takes people to have readiness. It takes soldiers, our Army civilians, and their families. It also takes our partners from industry doing the extraordinary work that I saw on the floor yesterday. And finally, of course, resources. And we've talked a lot about resources. We have to have sustained, consistent funding so we can maintain the readiness of our forces. So that product of the Department of the Army, those trained and ready units, are the best trained and the most ready units that we can develop. And again, remember the deal that Congress is offering us. They will help us rebuild the Army. We must, and when I say we, I mean the Army and industry, must find the way to reform our business practices so that we can be more effective and efficient in the future. So, readiness, people, resources, rebuild, and reform. Those are the things I'd like you to remember. Again, remember, our Army is well-led, most capable, and is the most lethal and effective land force in the world today. We are one of the most admired institutions in this nation. Another thing that this nation loves is innovation. We need to be able to take the innovation that's happening in private industry and meld it with the institution that is the United States Army. This will enable us in the future to ensure that our soldiers never have to face a fair fight. Regardless of political party, administration, or strategic era, this is our shared and sacred obligation. So to close, let me say thanks. Thanks for what you do for our soldiers. Thanks for what you do for our Army. And thanks for what you do for our nation. Thank you.